Cited Right, Basics, Part 6, Principle 2, Authorship, or How do I cite in the text? When you're citing, you generally have two different options. You can either cite directly, which means you quote, cite word for word, or you cite indirectly, meaning you paraphrase, you use your own words. I assume that if I show you these two examples, example 1, ein Buch zitieren, aus dem man einen Satz übernommen hat, heißt Schulden zahlen, and example 2, Umberto Eco compares citing to paying off debts, that you all know that the example 1 is a direct citation, a quotation, and that the example 2 is a paraphrase, an indirect citation. Now, my question to you is, when do you quote and when do you paraphrase? And for this question, I would like you to stop this video again and think about it. When do you quote, cite directly, and when do you paraphrase, using your own words? You might have been wondering what this picture of this present is doing here. And this is actually the answer to the question, because it depends on whether you want to refer to the content or to the wrapping, whether you quote or paraphrase. So if the content of the present, the idea, is important, then you paraphrase. If the wrapping, the way something is phrased is important, if the words are important, then you would quote. And in the fields, in the STM fields, the science, technology, and medicine fields, it's the general rule that you paraphrase, unless the wording is important, and that is very rarely the case. So for you, the rule is that you paraphrase and phrase everything in your own words. This is also very nice for your reader, because your reader can follow one writing style and doesn't have to adapt to a new writing style for every new sentence or every new paragraph. But it is sometimes something we see a lot with very unexperienced students. They tend to overquote. They often feel a bit insecure about really whether they understood it correctly and whether they can phrase it nicely, and then they, just to be sure, often tend to quote more than would be necessary and then would be sensible. So if you can paraphrase, if it's about the idea, please always paraphrase. By the way, it also shows a much higher level of competency, because it shows that you didn't just find a citation which is somehow connected to your work, to a research idea or to your research question, but it shows that you understood the citation, that you can phrase it in your own words, that you can include it into your train of thought and put it into context with your research question. So as most of you are writing some kind of exam, it's also a way to show your competency in your field of study. So if there isn't really a necessity to quote, then please paraphrase. But still, when is it necessary to quote? Because of course you also might have to quote. That is usually the case if you, for example, work with definitions. Then often the definition and how it is phrased is important. Sometimes also if you work with standards or with laws. But apart from this, it's not very often the case that you really have to quote. So paraphrase if possible. I would like to give you a few details about how to cite in your text. And I will start with quotations and then continue with paraphrases. What you all know is that if you quote something, you have to mark it as a quotation. And for this, you usually use quotation marks. That's one way how to mark a quotation. For longer quotations, and we would say they are longer if they are at least 3 lines long, you can also use a different formatting. You can, for example, indent the citation, or you can use italics or a smaller font. When you quote, you have to use the quotation unchanged. You cannot change anything, which also means that if there is for example, a spelling error in the word, or if there is an old spelling, you still have to keep the old incorrect spelling. But you can indicate to your reader that you know that this word or the sentence is not correct by today's standards, and that you have recognized that this is, for example, an old spelling. And you can indicate it by giving a sic in square brackets with an exclamation mark directly after the faulty word. In some fields, we would also use just an exclamation mark in square brackets instead of the sic with exclamation mark. Sic is Latin and it means exactly so. So this tells your reader, I know that there is, for example, a spelling mistake, but that's exactly how I found it in the original source. I didn't just mistype it, I didn't work sloppily. That's how the original source said it. If I say you can't change anything, that's not entirely true. Especially if we stick to the rule that we should only cite as much as absolutely necessary, then we might want to just use part of a sentence which we have to integrate into our own sentence structure. And in this case, we often have to change the word order in order to create a correct grammatical sentence. So then we have to leave out a word in one place and insert it in another place. And as long as it doesn't change the meaning and we indicate the change, we are allowed to do so. And we can indicate the omissions when we leave something out by giving 3 dots in square brackets. In some fields, you would also use round brackets instead of square brackets. And then in the place where we insert the missing word, we would again insert the word but in square brackets, which just says, well, the word didn't originally stand in this position in the sentence. And we can also use the omission signs when we want to reduce a very long sentence, for example, with a lot of subclauses to the main statement we want to make. Then we can, for example, leave out the subclauses by indicating the omission by these omission signs. But we might also have the opposite situation, that we have a sentence which refers to an earlier explanation, and we don't want to give the whole explanation, but somehow our reader has to know what it refers to. So, for example, if we have a sentence like, this causes a rise in temperature of 3 degrees, then our reader doesn't know what this refers to. So we might want to give a short explanation. Maybe this refers to a change in pressure or something. So we can, after the word we want to explain, in square brackets, give a short explanation and then divided by a colon or a semicolon, say author's note, which says, this is a short explanation from me as the writer to you as my reader to make you understand what this citation is about. But it wasn't phrased like this in the original source. It's information from me to you. When we want to quote something from a different language, I often get the question whether you have to translate it. And if you translate it, whether you have to do it like word for word. And the answer is you can't change anything, which means if you translate, you would change something. So if you quote something from a different language, you quote it in the original language. And if you, for example, write in German and you have an English quotation, you just use the English quotation, because English is the language of the academic field, so everyone knows how to speak English and would understand the quotation. But for example, if you have a language which you can't expect your reader to understand, then you would give a translation in the footnote. So you wouldn't translate the quotation and then put it in quotation marks. You would give the quotation in the original language and then give a translation in the footnote. And then you would also indicate who translated the quotation. I have one last issue about quotations, and this is a very special case. It's about a quotation within a quotation. Sometimes you want to quote something and part of it was a quote already. And in this case, you somehow have to indicate that part of your quotation was a quotation already. And in Germany, you usually do it by using double quotation marks around the outer quotation and single quotation marks around the inner quotation. But if you, for example, write in English, this might be the other way around. Then you might have the single quotation marks around the outer quotation and the double quotation marks around the inner quotation. So just have a look how it is done in your field. And then we have the question, which source would I reference? Because here we have two different sources. And in this case, you would, of course, first make sure that the inner quotation, the part which was a quote already, that this was quoted correctly. And then you would, for example, in your in-text citation, say, Miller quotes Smith. Then we know that Miller was the author of the outer quotation and Smith was the author of the inner quotation. And then you would give both references in the reference list. So let's turn to paraphrases. You of course know that if you paraphrase, you always use your own words. Using your own words does not mean that you have to invent new words for subject-specific terms. If you have a sentence and there are several subject-specific terms, it doesn't necessarily mean that you have plagiarized. You can't just replace these terms because they are so concise in their meaning that you usually have to use them. So don't worry about this. But apart from this, you should always phrase yourself, find your own writing style. If you cite in your text, you have several positions where you can give the reference, and these different positions mean different things. So first, if you put your in-text reference within the sentence you cited before the full stop, it means that it refers only to this one sentence. And if you instead place it after the full stop, it means that it refers to the whole paragraph. So really be clear in where you put your in-text citations. You can also give the reference in an introductory sentence or an introductory phrase. Like, for example, as Echo 2010 points out, and then you say what he pointed out. So in this case, you named the source right at the beginning of the sentence, which is really nice if you want to really point out to your reader who the author was. If it's, for example, a very famous scientist and you want to stress that that this result came from him, that's a good way to do it. And it's also a really good way to refer to ideas or results from someone if you need to cite more than one sentence and less than a whole paragraph. For example, if you have 2 or 3 sentences, you can start with such an introductory phrase where you give the reference in the introductory phrase, as Echo 2010 points out, and then you say what he pointed out. And if you in the next sentence refer back to this one sentence, like for example, he also found out that, then you know that he still refers to Echo, so your reader still knows where the reference came from. And if you in this way refer back to the sentence where you gave the reference, you don't have to give the in-text reference after each sentence. So that's a good way to give reference for several sentences within a paragraph. It's not about the whole paragraph. And of course, if you have finished retelling what Echo found out, you somehow, by phrasing it properly, you have to indicate who is speaking next. Is it something you say or is it another source? So you then really have to be clear with your phrases to indicate, to lead your reader so that he knows who's speaking next. But when you paraphrase, you always have to do a lot of leading your reader through your words to tell him where a citation starts and where it ends and where it came from. So always make sure to really have a look that it is always clear which information came from which source. You can also use these introductory phrases if you want to tell your reader that you took more than a few sentences from one source. For example, if you want to say, well, maybe I have taken 2 or 3 paragraphs from one source, then you can also say something like, the following paragraph or the following 2 paragraphs summarize the results of study XY. And then your reader knows, okay, this reference refers to the next 2 paragraphs. So in this case, you don't have to give a reference after each sentence or after each paragraph, because from the very beginning, you told him how far your citation goes. And still, when another speaker continues, you have to kind of indicate that someone else is speaking then. One other thing you might have seen is an in-text reference which gives several sources, like this: author 1, author 2, author 3. And I first tell you, well, this is not. That's not a collecting bin where you just put in all the different sources you used in one paragraph without indicating which information came from which source. This is a so-called multiple citation, which means that the statement you just want to give a reference for, that this statement was given by all these 3 authors. They must have said exactly the same. So this is a means to stress how well established a meaning or a method is, or how widely spread or supported an opinion is, for example. I have a few more details I would like to share with you, which apply both to quotations as well as to paraphrases. In my courses, I am sometimes asked whether you should give page numbers in your in-text citation or not. And the answer really is, it depends on your citation style. There are citation styles which give the cited pages, and then there are citation styles which don't. So it really depends on the style you have to follow. If you have the choice and you can choose your own citation style, I would advise to choose a style which gives page numbers, because it makes it much easier for yourself as well as for your reader to find a piece of information you want to check. And this, if you choose a citation style which gives page numbers, you always give page numbers, not just for quotations, but also for paraphrases. You might have come across in-text citations like this: Müller 2010A and Müller 2010B. And there are basically 2 different situations when this can occur. First, you have one author by the name of Müller, and he has written 2 different publications in 2010, which you both cite in your work. In this case, you somehow have to let your reader know which of these 2 publications the citation came from. Second situation, you have 2 different authors by the name of Müller who wrote something and published something in 2010, which you cited in your work. Again, your reader has to be able to distinguish between the 2 different works and where the information actually came from. If you use a reference management program, these programs usually add these letters ABC automatically, so that you don't have to worry about it. But if you do your citations manually, you really should have a look that there is no in-text citation which might be ambiguous, which might refer to different references in your reference list. The next point is a point which I find really important, and I'm also being asked a lot about it. It's about secondary citations. If you have a work and you find a citation in this work and you want to cite this citation, then your first job is to go back to the original source, find out whether the citation is correct, whether this original source really said this, and then you can cite the original source directly. And how far do you have to go to acquire this this original source? Well, a simple Google search won't do it. You really have to dig a bit deeper. As a rule of thumb, you can say that you have to acquire everything you can via the national-wide, the German-wide interlibrary loan. And most of the sources you have to use, you can usually get by this interlibrary loan. So only if you really can't get hold of the original source, then you can use a secondary citation. And a secondary citation means that you can't check the original source, and in this case you somehow have to let your reader know that you weren't able to check the source, but you used it secondhand, you could say. And this could look in the in-text citation like this. Müller 2000 cited from May 2001, which means the original source, the original citation, comes from Müller 2000. But this source you were not able to read, so you cited it from May 2001. And the next question is, which reference do you have to put into your reference list? And there are two different positions you could take. The first one is your reader wants to find out about the original source, so you should definitely give Müller 2000 in your reference list. But as you didn't read this, you of course also have to give the May 2001. That's the source you really read. But then there is this other position which says that you can only list in your reference list what you have read yourself. So according to this, you wouldn't be allowed to list Müller 2000 in your reference list. And here you really have to check with your supervisor how you should do it, whether you should give the original source even if you couldn't read it or not. But anyhow, you have to indicate in your in-text citation that you used this citation secondhand. And I know that this is a lot of work to always find out about the original source and check it and then cite this directly. But this is really, really important in order to not spread false information, because secondary citations have the tendency to change the meaning of the citation the more often it is cited secondarily. So at the end, often the statement is a completely different one from the one the original source author said in the first place. So in Germany, we have this game called Stille Post. In English, I think you call it Chinese whispers, where you whisper something in someone's ear and he tells it the next one and the next person and the next person, and at the end, something completely different from what the route first started comes out. So it's really important that you check your sources and make sure that you don't spread false information. You might also have seen something like this, Müller et al. And this means that Müller is not the only author here, but that there were several other authors involved in this piece. And whether you have to give et al. In your in-text citation, again, depends on your citation style. There are citation styles which shorten a list of authors using et al., and then there are others which don't, which just give no indication in the in-text reference whether there were other authors involved or not. So again, it's a matter of your citation style. Both is correct. And my last thing on this topic is about missing information. Sometimes there is a piece of information missing you would usually give in your reference. And if you can't find out about this information, for example, you really can't find out who the author was or when something was published, then you can indicate again that you searched for it, but that you couldn't find it, that you just couldn't acquire this information. So it's again a bit similar to the sick indication, when you tell your reader that you really didn't work sloppily, but that this information just really couldn't be found. And you have a few abbreviations you can use for this. In English, we use NU for name unknown if you can't find out the name of the author, NY for no year if you can't find out when it was published, and NP for no place if you can't find out where it was published. There are these abbreviations, of course, also in Latin. So depending on in which language you would use them in your work, I would also give you the Latin abbreviations. These are NN for nomen nescio, which means name unknown, SA for sine annum, which means without year, or SL for sine locum, which means without location.